Welcome back to Star Narratives, the podcast. This is accessible and relatable astrology that teaches you how to support your emotional health using the wisdom of the zodiac. I'm your host, Natha Campanella. Hello, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with me for another episode. And it is Taurus season. And so my guest today is all about that Taurus vibe. And if you missed my last podcast, it is on Taurus. It's a solo cast, and it's just me talking about the archetype. So go back and listen to that. You don't have to listen to that before you listen to this, but it is full of a lot of more well-rounded information about Taurus. But I always describe Taurus as the garden in the chart. Wherever Taurus, Ceres, Venus, the second house, all four of those things are very connected to that proverbial garden. We have to tend the garden, right? We have to practice the self-care if we're going to be able to navigate our outside world with success. And it's not always easy. So my guest today has a lot to say about that very thing. She makes it her mission to teach women how to care for themselves deeply and thoroughly with intention. Her name is Alyssa Neill. She's a registered dietitian of nutrition, and she is a big advocate for caring for ourselves on a deep level. And we talk quite a bit about that. And she has a very strong Taurus Ceres signature in her chart, so it's not surprising that this kind of work is what she's doing. I know as I talked to her, I made so many connections to my own life, my own situation, my own relationship to food, to my body, to the way that I care for myself, and to the ways that I have not cared for myself in the past. And I'm doing much better now, but it's taken work. And we talk about that, how sometimes we have to give up coping mechanisms and we have to let go of conditioning when it comes to really taking care of ourselves in an optimal way. So I hope that you enjoy this talk. We mention a few things that I'll leave in the show notes. And I think that's all I need to say. Enjoy. I loved talking to Alyssa, and you'll be able to tell. All right. Hi, Alyssa.
Hi, Natha. How's it going?
I'm good. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. You and I have worked together. I've been your client and you've been mine, but I was really excited about this interview because there are just so many stories about you and how you got to where you are that I am always dying to ask you, and we just never have a chance. So I'm psyched you're here.
Yes, me too. I love storytelling, and it always is. It's always such a it might be fun to listen to stories, but it's always an experience to tell them too, because I feel like every time you tell a story, you kind of learn more about the story. Even if it's really subtle, you're like, oh, there's resistance there. Oh, there's something there. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, this is great. So we're going to be releasing this in May, which is the month of Taurus. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted you to come on for this episode, is because you have such a strong Taurus nature. And what I mean by that is that Taurus brings this real practical, dependable, deliberate sense to the table, especially when it comes to things that are physical, ways that we care for ourselves or don't. And you have many strong markers in this chart that we're going to get into and talk about. But I thought before we would do that, I just want to ask you to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing, and then we'll keep going from there.
Oh, okay. Who I am and what I'm doing. So what a question. My Pisces moon is like, who am I? I don't know. Great question. So my, kind of like what I always joke about, my alias is, I'm a registered dietitian. Whenever I tell people who know me that, or who know that I am a registered dietitian, or who know my work, they always kind of laugh and they're like, okay, but like, what do you mean? Like, what are you really? And so then I go into the next step, which is like, truly, I am a nourishment evangelist. What does that even mean? Well, one of the big drivers through my life has been this concept of really like caring for the self, which, generations before my generation, I think a lot of the time that was like thought of as negative or selfish. And it is selfish, but at the same time, that selfishness drives self-preservation. It fills your cup. It creates a really strong foundation for the individual. And in my experience, it's created a really strong foundation for me to say, hey, I actually do need to nourish by putting my needs first. So that I can show up in all of the other circumstances where my needs don't come first, whether it's working with my clients on their nutrition, on their nourishment at large, you know, self-expressing, creating, writing, connecting, holding space in all the various ways that I enjoy doing, such as like retreats and moon circles and rituals and, creation through Patreon, Instagram, etc. So that I can actually show up to those spaces with a willingness to really extend forth because my needs have been met. So I would say like that is the long and short of who I am. And when I talk about needs being met, yeah, like you're saying, the tactile, physical needs, like, am I sleeping enough? Am I connecting with people I love? Am I eating well? Am I staying hydrated? Am I moving in a way that feels satisfying to my physical body and my mind? But then also some of the less tactile things, right? Like emotional wellness and learning what emotions are and learning how to navigate in like expressing yourself, whether that's through the creation of photos or writing or in a relationship or sexual desires and needs. So there's just a lot of focus around my wellness, my nourishment, and organically, as I've practiced that for so long, coming from a place where, it almost was like overboard when I was younger. I'm sure we'll touch on that. It's extended itself really nicely into the other because my own personal boundaries and values in focusing on my nourishment allow me compassion and really strong connection with my community and the people that I am creating with.
Wow, it's so interesting as you're talking, so many what we typically consider to be Venus keywords are coming up. And, you mentioned this a few times as, is in other words, but is self-care selfish, right? And so many of us have really gotten that message that it is. And yet there is this resurgence of the divine feminine from where I stand, where it's becoming so obvious that we have to learn how to take care of ourselves in really important ways, in deep ways. Like you mentioned, it's not just about, am I getting enough exercise? Am I getting enough sleep? And those things are so important, but this component of emotional wellness,
right,
and self-expression and sexual desires. And it's this whole puzzle that has to come together to really support us. And I know from working with you personally that you are so skilled in doing this, in just pulling on different, threads of the tapestry until they begin to really take form and shape.
I love that. Thank you for that reflection. And yeah, it's so funny because that's when you were like a lot of, kind of Venus keywords. I wasn't even thinking about Venus and nor Taurus, none of those things. And when you started to kind of lay out like, oh, this is where we're going to go, I was like, okay, I'm going to get to learn during this for sure. And when I heard myself, just explain like quote unquote who I was and what I do, I was like, wow, the two are not separate. Like who I am and what I do, they're really one thing. And what it comes back to is building that foundation, like just listening to what you just said, right now in the world where we're experiencing a pandemic with the most people on earth, like yesterday, 3 out of my 4 calls were reminding my nourishment clients that the foundation that we have for ourself, for our care, for our, really like deep, deep wellness is what's going to allow us to be vital, to be resilient, to be creative and adaptive and resourceful. And, it goes overlooked so much, but like you just said, it's far beyond just like the food you eat and how you move. It's like, when people say you're not, it's not just about what you eat, but what you're thinking about when you eat, right? Like, it's not just about what you eat, but also what's eating you. It's like if you build that foundation strong, you're nourishing so deeply that it's hard to shake you. And, we're all human, but yeah, I'm so curious to see where we're about to go and what we're going to explore and unearth just with these archetypes.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that. So Venus rules 2 signs. Venus rules Libra and Taurus. And so for this conversation, we're focusing on Taurus. And so, the Venus-Taurus connection is huge. And this archetype has a very feminine, feminine feel to it. It's, of course, about things like love and passion, but it's also about our self-concept and our self-worth. And the way that we care and nurture for ourselves, and what we learned about that from our own mothers. And so I want to bring in the asteroid Ceres into this conversation too, because some astrologers say that Ceres is the ruler of Taurus. And so I tend to kind of ride the fence on that. I like both Venus and Ceres as rulership. Because they both bring different things to the table. So Venus is about that having to take agency and really see the way that, how do I feel about myself, and how is that reflected in the way that I'm able to get what I want? Because Taurus is so connected to abundance, especially financial abundance, but really abundance that is anything that we consider to be valuable, that we want. And if our Venus is struggling, then we're put in a position in our lives where we aren't getting our physical needs met. We don't have emotional wellness. We don't know how to self-express, and maybe we aren't so good at boundaries. And, we can have a Venus in our chart that is struggling in the chart, but that doesn't mean that we have to then live that out. So there's a huge amount of self-responsibility that shows up with Venus. And I think that that's one of the really beautiful things about your work, is that you show up with a lot of knowledge, and you can educate your clients and you can put the pieces together for them. But ultimately, they have to take the responsibility for how to do that. And so then we move into Ceres, and Ceres is also about all of those things, except that with Ceres, we have to look back at the quality of care that we received as a child. And we pull that into the picture, because we learn how to care for our bodies and nurture our bodies by, one, what we saw our mothers doing to their own bodies, and 2, by the way that we were held and handled and fed and cared for. So the same thing is true. Some of us have a very difficult Ceres in our chart, and that means that we have probably a little bit more work. Our journey is a little longer, but ultimately Ceres points us in the direction of learning how to re-mother ourselves. Learning how to really say, I didn't have this, I needed it, but I can give it to myself now. And so in your chart, you have, not a big surprise, but you have your Venus opposing your Ceres very closely, which says to me that for you, there's this balance of, there might have been times in your life, and this is going to be my next question for you, but there might have been times when you were very out of balance. Your self-worth might have been your self-worth might have been struggling. Your desire to care for your own body might have been harder. And yet, as you progress in your life and it's so interesting that you got called to this exact thing that you're doing, because it's like your chart shouts it loud and clear that in this life, you are here to bring balance to those things. How do I care for myself? How do I love myself? And what do I do when both of those are out of reach or feeling difficult? So I want to stop there. And I just want to ask you, I guess, what's your reflection to that? And then later we can move into what has your past been like in respect to this?
Wow. You just touched on so many words that catalyzed like whole thought processes in my head that, yes, you've got to love the accuracy of astrology, right? Like of a natal chart. It's always so humbling. You're like, okay, yes, we're right where we need to be here. So let's see where to start. So Venus opposing Ceres. So to start off, yes, when I was younger, well, actually, let me start with mother. So my mother is one of the most incredible humans I have ever experienced. Her wisdom like surpasses anyone I have ever met. Like one day on her, 1 year on her birthday, I sent her like, I think it was a list of like 30 quotes that I just remember her like little bits of wisdom, like laying down for me over and over and over and over and over again. And when she received it, she was like, did I say all those things really? And I was like, yeah, like a lot. You said them a lot. So, I sent her all this and she has no idea that she says any of it. She's like, yeah, some of that's familiar. But the one thing that really stood out to me in all of this was her saying to me, the one, we'll use the word regret softly because she said something along these lines. I think she might have said regret. The one regret I have as a mother is not spending enough time taking care of myself throughout motherhood, but especially when you were young. She was like, I didn't make my eating a priority and I didn't make my movement a priority. And I think that my mental and physical health suffered because of it. And I remember it hitting me in this point where I could understand her point, which was not, oh, poor me, my health has suffered, but it was the one regret I have as a mother is that I can see in hindsight, maybe I would have done this better, aka being a mother, if I had cared for myself more deeply, more thoroughly, with more intention. And it hit me so hard, and I was so sobered by it. I was like, oh, okay. Because she was essentially saying in that moment, like, Alyssa, you have to promise me that if you're ever a mother, that you'll do that you'll take care of yourself, that you'll put yourself first. And how it landed for me is, regardless of what you're doing, right? Because we can mother so many things, whether it's, a relationship with someone, a child, a business, a creative experience, anything. How it hit me was for optimal interaction, experience, life, understanding, you have to take care of yourself first and foremost every single time.
Wow. That is so apt. And something that's been coming up for me over and over is that saying, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first before you help others. And It's not something that we really are taught, is it?
No, it's not something that we're taught. And it's really interesting because, when we talk about like all of these archetypes, it's so apparent for me that like, even as, we all could mother ourselves better, right? Like we really could. But even beyond that statement, there's also this like empowerment and this sense of confidence and rising that's delivered when we not only mother ourselves better and put our, base foundational needs first, like sleep, shelter, food, but we also take responsibility for providing the things that nourish us on a higher level, like pleasure, creation, connection, expression. And that's one of the things I have actually never like taken the moment to be like, oh yeah, my Venus and Ceres are opposite. But one of the really strong teachings for me has been to take responsibility for what I want, right? Because for me, like, I'm a very passionate person, and I have these like idealistic fantasy dreams, you know, of how situations are going to go. And I've been like this since I was really young. And at the beginning of realizing I was like this, I was just frustrated all the time because I was always disappointed in how the situation played out. I was like, oh, that didn't compare at all to what my brain's version, what the version that would best nourish me is. And as I got older and was in like a healthier romantic relationship, it became a catalyst for me to go back to that mothering concept and be like, look, part of mothering yourself is actually going, hey, I'm responsible for my own pleasure. I'm responsible for my own experience. Yeah, our partners can give us love and nourishment and romance and, you know, intimate sexuality. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I am the one that can do that the best for myself, whether it's nourishing through self-pleasure, self-touch, or food, or, you know, just setting the mood for myself in my workspace, right? Like, it is ultimately my responsibility. And it just goes back to that statement my mom made where she was reflecting on, and she is an incredible mother, but where she was reflecting on her experience, and just that really simple statement allowed me to go, oh, wow, like that's actually so profound. And it's something that I have been able to weave into my life since then. Now, talking like past history stuff, how was their imbalance? If you asked anyone in my family, so either my parents and actually probably my brothers too, they would tell you that, you know, I am one really passionate about things that I care about, right? Like that uncontrollable emotional experience kind of thing where it's like my whole world will revolve around things that I care about. And if you take that and you juxtapose it onto being a teenager, right? And learning about like the food system and health and how, you know, we essentially live in disease, in illness. We don't eat well. We don't care for ourselves. We don't move enough. We don't sleep enough. We don't sleep well. From a really young age, I became, let's say, maybe I'm trying to think of the number that it was. I would say probably about 13 years old. I became so hyper-focused, Natha, on my wellness. So I've always been very resilient, very healthy, athletic. But at the age of 13, something really broke. And I was like, I became so rigid in my experience of what wellness had to be, right? You know, when you learn something new and it's almost like the integration process of the skill set of the foundation becomes your hyper focus. It becomes your world, right? And I remember it affected everything from like, I was a 13-year-old girl, like going to bed at 9:30, 9 p.m. and waking up at like 4 a.m. to go work out before high school. And then, you know, go and pack my lunch and make these like beautiful salads. And I would only eat certain foods. And I would like get physically sick and anxious if like there weren't foods available to me that were healthy, quote unquote, right? Like it was such an obsession to be healthy that it was actually not healthy at all. Now we would diagnose it as orthorexia, but at the time it was more of, I don't even know that word existed in the diagnostic like catalog, right? So that was happening. And interestingly enough, while that was happening, I had a doctor say to me, hey, you've always been in the 95th percentile for height and weight. And now you're down here in the 5th percentile for weight. And, you know, so I'm curious, like, do you have a period? And I was like, no, I haven't bled in like 3 months. And she was like, well, yeah, you've lost 30 pounds in 3 months. Of course you haven't bled. She's like, well, you need to go on birth control. And something in me just like flipped. And I was like, if I'm doing this for so-called optimal health, for deep, deep, deep nourishment, I didn't have the, you know, the words at the time, but I knew the feeling that I wanted to achieve and the balance that I wanted to strike. I was like, if I'm actually doing that for if I'm actually eating this way and moving and reading and learning these skill sets and growing my own food, if I'm doing this for optimal health, I need to strike a balance. And so I remember looking the doctor in the eye and going, I don't want to go on birth control. And she said, fine, well then you need to gain weight until you get your period. And once your period comes back, you know that you're at your minimum weight, that, you know, your sex hormones are happy and they're healthy and they're juiced up and you're good to go, you know? And I was like, I have to gain weight? You mean after I just worked so hard to lose weight, I have to gain it? And then I was like, hold on, like balance, right? Like the intensity and passion that I took into that experience, especially as like a young woman, was so intense and so fiery and hot and focused. And it got totally put out that day, and almost like it got refocused, where I was like, hey, you just went way too far in one direction and you need to come back a little bit and balance out. And there's always been this pendulum for me, especially when I was young. It's really evened out as I've gotten older and learned and had more and more experiences around what wellness actually feels like in my mind and body and through my soul. But when I was young, the pendulum swang like that many times, where wellness was driven by looking a certain way. Wellness was driven by some new information that I learned. Like I remember, not that this is hilarious, but I remember refusing to go in my family's pool because it was chlorinated. I would not go in the pool. I was like, chlorine will kill you. It's not good for your skin or your cells, and it's absorbed into, like, I think I was probably 15 at that time, right? So like these really, really, really obsessed moments that were just so hyper focused that had no balance to them. And over time, because I always know what those feel like, they create a literal anxiety in my physical body. I always know when I'm off balance because that anxiety strikes and boom, I'm like, oh, this is not optimal wellness. Like back it up, come back into balance. And so the fact that you said that Venus is opposing Ceres, I'm like, ooh, that's something I want to learn more about and dive into, because it makes so much sense. Because for me, I'm just ready. For me, this is the takeaway. If I am not well, if I am not nourished, and I mean like deep nourishment with integrity, not obsessive nourishment, not hyper focus on a weight or a certain look, but if I am not deeply nourished with integrity, there is no way that I can exalt my Venus-like qualities. There's no way I can, you know, have healthy sex hormones and a healthy sex drive and endurance and creation and intuition and connection in that like really beautiful expressive state. And I'm just realizing that as you tell me this placement. So thank you for bringing that to the surface.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing some of your story. It makes so much sense. And it also really tells me how some of why you're able to show up with clients in the way that you are, because you have this really like you're not judgmental, and yet you kind of have the underlying knowledge for all of this stuff. Because my guess, and you know, I don't know that I have ever met a woman who doesn't in some way struggle with body image, with food, with, you know, this whole idea that we must somehow control what goes into our body so that we can control the appearance. And it is deep. It's deep.
Yes, it is.
You know, and hearing you talk about your own experience is really helpful. And it makes me think that, you know, part of this whole Venus archetype, and really this shows up in a few different archetypes in the chart. This is very Plutonian. It's very connected to Venus, but this idea of we have to be willing to get rid of things in order to make room for our creative expression and for our ability to self-nurture. And then the question is, what are we getting rid of? And it's always this, you know, we're always being asked by Pluto to get rid of things that we hold dear, but things that are dysfunctional. Right. So, you know, for me personally, I have a similar backstory to you in that food became the way for me to control my life. And it started around 14. And that it's, you know, this addictive quality of ooh, I can control the way my body looks based on what I'm putting in or out of.
Mm-hmm.
And how, as I've progressed through my life, I've really had to consciously get rid of some of those belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
Even when, like you said, I can tell my anxiety starts to peak in my body. And when that anxiety peaks, then I almost, if I'm not careful, will slip into, oh, I know a way to control this. But having to say that is not going to deeply nourish me with integrity. And so I have to make a conscious effort to not do that. And I think that that's what a lot of people struggle with. And so I'm curious for you, um, how do you work with clients who are aware that they have some dysfunctional tendencies around food, eating, nourishment, and are scared to let them go?
Such a great question. So I want to, if you don't mind, I want to start just with something that you said at the beginning, because I think it's really poignant and it ties perfectly into that last question. But I've never met a woman who didn't have some kind of experience around food, their body control, their image, etc. Something that I have seen, and this was the moment for me that really like jet propelled me out of disordered eating and disordered thinking about my body. And of course, these things always ebb and flow because conditioning goes really deep and it is so societal and it's constant. But it was the moment where I realized the level of like mind control that it had over me. My curiosity, my drive, my creative expression, as my nana told me, your sparkle's gone. That's what she said to me. And I remember the moment where it hit me and I was like, this is control over, obsessing over calories, obsessing over what you eat, being so hungry throughout the day, being so rigid and driven. It really closes the earth down to you. It closes your options. They become very narrow, right? And this whole like probably generations who have experienced, specifically women and, femininity being controlled by how we look, what we eat, being hungry, not having enough just fuel, enough calories, enough energy to pursue the things that we love. Never mind to have a foundation strong enough to have the will and the drive and the confidence to feel like we can pursue those things. You know how it feels to be hangry and hungry. It's so distracting. You cannot think. You are not your highest self, right? And so this is just one of those things where like if anyone's listening to this right now and they've experienced that, don't turn it inward and go, oh, what's wrong with me? I'm so horrible. Turn it outward and go, look, that's conditioning that we've been subjected to as a means of control. And even if it's in really subtle layers, us peeling those back and saying, hey, look, that we don't want to be controlled. We want to have full expression. And the only way to do that is to nourish so deeply that your foundation is strong and your roots reach deep and you can soak in nutrients and you have the brain power and the capacity and the energy to create because you are well fed. And as a woman, if we're not well fed, our sex hormones will shut our system down. We will get anxious. Our brain chemistry gets all messed up. And from there, it's just a feedback loop, right? And so in relation to the question that you just asked, having just laid that foundation and point of view, whenever there is a client who is experiencing any kind of disordered eating or, body image dysmorphia, or, it's really hard to even name these things because they're so specific to the person and their experiences growing up and in relationship and so on and so forth. But when someone's experiencing these things, time is our friend and talking about them is always our friend, because often a lot of these elements, whether it's, anorexia, bulimia, just rigidity around eating, rigidity around pleasure and experiencing food or experiencing their body, there's a lot of shame, right? It's like there's this interesting kind of dichotomy of virtue and shame. There's virtue because probably they've been complimented or exalted for their appearance that has been based on those, restrictions or rigid eating patterns or thinking patterns. And so at the same time, there's also shame because they know nourishment is based on feeling. If we're really truly nourishing for our individual self, we are listening to our body's feedback, right? Which comes in the language of signs and symptoms and feelings. And so if someone's really deeply nourishing, they feel great. If someone's in that rigid space of disordered eating or thinking about their body, they really do not feel great, right? They might be exalted culturally. However, talking about it in time, And once they're flooded, once they take the risk a couple times to nourish a little bit more deeply than they have, or to hold themselves to a less rigid schedule or a less rigid structure, they start to become flooded with what feels like life, vitality, deep nourishment, excitement, ecstasy, right? The feeling of connection. It's like their life force comes back. And all it takes are a couple times of that happening for someone, and all of a sudden it's like the path is paved, right? The path becomes paved, and all of a sudden, even if it's slow, they start trending in the right direction because they know that that feeling felt true in their body, and they know that that's why they're here, is to experience life and its fullness. And they know that even though there are all of these constructs and these walls that have been built and this ball and chain to looking a certain way, they know that that doesn't actually feel the best. And so it really becomes something where it's not me trying to convince them to eat more. It's not me trying to convince them to change behavior. It's them seeing the situation in a different light.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. And when we're talking about Ceres, there is this connection. I mean, Ceres is also a very big archetype. Um, she's connected to the principle of the universal mother, lessons of attachment and separation. And so again, we're looking at attachment to the ways that we're doing self-care, being able to separate from some of those ways that we're doing self-care. And Ceres is also connected to loss and what we lost somewhere along the way that we want to find again. And listening to you talk about some of that really makes me just think about that idea. For me, what was it that I lost? And so this is sort of a side astrology note, is that you can tell a lot about your Ceres by looking at the sign that your Ceres falls in. And so if you listening do not have a copy of your natal chart, you can find, I have a thing on my website, nathacampanella.com, where you can go download my ebook, and it gives you instructions for how to get your natal chart, and it will also tell you a little bit about Ceres, and then you can figure out what sign your Ceres lands in. But when we're talking about qualities of loss, things that we felt were missing when we were children, that we then are trying to fill, we're trying to fill up those holes. And a lot of us think that the holes are filled up by, some of these kind of ways that we're controlling and managing and trying to fit our bodies and our experience into a certain box. For me, my Ceres is in the sign of Taurus. And I think that when I ask myself that question, where was my loss? And I think a lot of my loss was feeling that the world was very unreliable. It was not very dependable. I didn't feel very in control as a child, and I had 4 parents, 2 different households that parented very differently. So my experience was going from one house to another over and over, and having to basically be a different person in each house. And so for me, my Ceres loss was around stability, which is a Taurus thing. Alyssa, for you, your Ceres is in the sign of Aquarius. And this is an interesting placement because, Aquarius is an air sign. And So, I have a mentor, Jamie Kale Miller, and when I was apprenticing with her, we did a big Ceres project.
Oh,
We
cool.
went through Ceres and the signs, and so I pulled up one of the diagrams that we did for Ceres in Aquarius. So I'm just going to read some of the things.
Okay.
So, Aquarius as a sign is an air. It's rebellious by nature. It prefers to have emotional distance, and there's a very, very much of a thinking outside of the box kind of quality that goes with Aquarius. But somebody with Ceres in Aquarius can lose touch really easily with their body because Aquarius is such a heady sign. So, I was reading this as you were talking and kind of laughing. Someone with Ceres in Aquarius can easily develop eccentric self-care rituals. In some ways, your relationship to your body is more of a theory than an actuality. And, your habits might involve some rebellion against societal norms, or maybe driven more by scientific ideas and less by common sense. And so I want to get your reflection on that. But the reason that I'm even bringing this up is because if you're listening to this, and, this is such a huge topic, and it's so personal. And sometimes when we're in the thick of our own stuff, it is very hard to see the forest for the trees. Yeah. But if you can, step aside a little and kind of say, oh, my Ceres is in this sign, and that's kind of what that means. It can give you some amazing insight into some of your stuff that might be just what you need to kind of wrap your head around what exactly is going on. But anyway, that aside, Alyssa, how do those descriptions feel to you?
I'm like laughing over here silently laughing because it's really interesting because, so I forget exactly what your words were, but it was one of the first or second qualities you read of Ceres in Aquarius, and I was thinking about how so many things, but when I was younger. And still, it's something that I'm still growing into, but I really have a very strong rebellious nature in the sense of like, not just rebellion for the sake of rebellion, but if something doesn't feel aligned to me and it's the norm, I will easily rebel against it. But I will also suffer the consequence of, oh gosh, people are going to be upset with me for rebelling. And so when I was younger, I was really, really, really well behaved because I wanted to be respected by my parents, especially because I loved them and I admire them. And just listening to you, I'm kind of laughing because if you like asked my parents what was like, name Alyssa's rebellion when she was younger, it would be around how they cared for themselves and how I therefore learned to care for myself. So I rebelled against that by being really specific about the kind of groceries that I needed to be bought. And then, I was like, well, never mind. I'll grocery shop for myself and I'll cook for myself and I'll make all my meals for myself and I'll, drive myself to the gym. I'll bike to the gym. I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself, right? Like all of these care things. I'll grow my own food. We have to grow our own food. Okay, fine. I'm going to go get manure. I'm going to make a garden. And I swear to you, my family was probably sitting there looking at me like with their eyes wide open, like, is this woman psycho? Like she's 15, 16 years old. Like what is happening right now? Like, so it's this interesting kind of like rebellion, but you can kind of scratch your head, right? Because you can picture it and you're like, well, is that rebellion? Yeah, it's rebellion when you're young and your family does things a certain way and it's not the wrong way, but it's not the way that you feel is the quote unquote right way at the time, right? And so when you just said it can be like really heady and kind of intellectualized, it's hilarious and so accurate because the beginning, like I just described, were really extreme behaviors, right? But they were behaviors that were backed by scientific research that I was reading. Well, don't eat any animal products. Okay, here's this. Don't eat this. Only buy organic. Only, buy local. There's less pesticides. There's this, there's that. And it was really rigid to the point where it didn't make sense to common sense, right? Like, and as I stayed in that rigidity, something in me didn't feel nourishing. That's why I use that word so much, because nutrition is nutrition. It's a little more sterile, right? It's like, you could argue so many things through the lens of nutrition, and I've probably tried all of them, but often they feel too sterile and they don't flow well with the alignment of like wellness and nourishment as a whole. And so that was my own little rebellion there, right? That was just like this moment of, hey, I'm going to do this my own way because this is what feels right to me. This is what feels good in my body. And so, yeah, there is for sure that like Ceres and Aquarius, there you go, like to a T. And it's gone away largely. Sorry about that. It's gone away largely, but it's still there sometimes. Now it's just tempered far faster by my reaction of, ooh, this doesn't feel deeply nourishing.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of this asteroid, and one of the reasons why I am always talking about Ceres with clients is it's, if we're looking at what do we need in order to feel nourished in our lives, and all we were going to do is translate the Ceres in your chart, we could really we could really get a very full picture. And so it is important for you that, food ideology, social change around food, exploring dietary experimentations, those things are all really important to you. And they will probably continue as your practice progresses, as you get older. It's like you need that. You need to have agency over your food, over your diet. But also at the same time, as is true with everybody's chart, there are all of these other pieces that need to come in and balance. So, for me with my Ceres in Taurus, it really took me until just probably 3 years ago to really get that I needed structure when it came to eating. I needed to be eating at the same time.
Yes.
Needed, all of these Taurus things.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, it's this big picture that we're always looking to translate, which is, your Venus, Alyssa, is in the sign of Leo. So that is very energetic and active and sexual and powerful. So you need those too, along with all the headiness. And then you have all of this Taurus in your chart, this Mars in Taurus that grounds you, that says, none of that is going to be useful to you if you're not also grounding. And so we all have these big pictures going on. So astrology is a great way to get a handle on it. But then what do you do with that information? Then you either learn how to facilitate these things within yourself, or you can, go to somebody like you who can really hold all of the pieces, and you have the language and the education. And that's been my experience with you, is that I feel like I came to you knowing a lot, but not all. And every time you and I have talked, I come away with this insight and these aha, wow. And I think part of that is, just you being you, but also that Ceres in Aquarius really sets you up to have the knowledge and have sourced the newest, most interesting pieces that you can then bring to clients. And can you feel some of that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And actually, one of the things that, thank you for that. First of all, that was, I'm like, oh, thank you, Natha. The other thing that just came to mind as you were talking is just this quality of, keeping this quality of lightness and experimentation in our nourishment and our self-care routines, because there are things, like you said earlier with Pluto, right, that we hold dear, but maybe they don't work the best for us. And sometimes like trying new things and combining different things and revisiting things we've done in the past, it can be so therapeutic, because if we're revisiting them, we're probably revisiting them through a different lens. I actually had an experience that you just really clearly dialed in, and it was that essentially it's a combination of factors, right? It's a combination of factors. So the other day, when I was younger, I kept a garden like all of the time. And for the last handful of years, like about 5, I've lived in a van. So there's been no garden kept. And this year I have been, as we moved into a home, I have been able to like buy chickens to get eggs and start seeds. And there was this element of, and you just really nailed it, of this Aquarian, like having autonomy, but in a collective way. Like this is something that's great for the collective. It's also something that's really great for me. It's deeply nourishing for me to grow my own food. And it's also deeply nourishing for, the environment around me that I'm going to have to mother in order to get the food that I need. Right. And then at the same time, in starting the garden, there was this quality that I totally forgot that I feel every year, but I hadn't felt in this same way until I was able to restart my gardening, which is this like erotic energy that comes in the spring, and that comes from tending to our needs and having that autonomy and authority over what we're feeding ourselves and how we're raising it and what we're doing and how we're putting into it. And at the same time, all of it creates this grounding, secure feeling because you are investing in your health. And I'm not saying you have to do this exact thing like starting a garden, but it's these elements at play, right, that we get to kind of manipulate, which is to try new things, to connect to our environment as much as possible, to feel what feels enlivening in our body. And ultimately, that's going to be different per person. But those things, and taking that experimental view on it as we grow and as we experience more things, more, time here on earth, is so important. Just lightness and experimentation and feeling how we feel in that moment. And when we feel really great, really fed, really nourished, knowing that that's our compass and heading that way further and further until we get to the point where we're like, yep, this is it right here.
Yes. Yes. And, it just to let everybody who's listening know is that, if we're looking to be a better mother to ourselves, and you happen to have Ceres, you happen to look at your natal chart and you're wanting to know, how can I be a better mother to myself? What does my Ceres need? All of the Ceres are going to need different things. So for you, your Ceres needs information to be able to delve into things that are odd and different and weird, because that nurtures you. Where for me, like we were saying, I need stability and I need ground. But if somebody has Ceres in a fire sign, well, you're going to want to mother that that energy, that physical energy. You're going to want to mother competition, healthy competition, and seeking out things that make you feel joyful and excited. And if your Ceres is in a water sign, you're going to want to mother your feelings. And we're all wanting to do all of it because that's the nature of us. We're multifaceted and we have everything in our charts. But just as a good starting place, where can we allow ourselves to, like you said, what feels enlivening in our bodies? That's sort of the starting point, is what feels enlivening versus what starts to generate anxiety and what makes us feel contracted and what makes us feel fearful, because those are the things that can act as the bell that, oh, I am maybe resorting to some of the dysfunctional ways, as opposed to really consciously mothering something that feels enlivening instead of something that feels but comfortable, right?
Wow. That's that is such a great description and reflection too on just like whether it's any of those elements that you named is just a great way to gauge what's working for you or not.
Yeah.
Question for you on Ceres. How does the house it's in play into the equation?
Yeah, that's a great question. The houses, if you don't have an accurate birth time, you won't be able to tell the house, but you can still get a lot of good info. But with an accurate birth time, you look at the house that your Ceres falls in, and the house is like the area of life that this thing will take you'll sort of focus in. So for you, your Ceres is in the first house, which is about your sense of self, how you are perceived, how are you showing up in the world. And so, of course, for you, it's very obvious. Things in the first house are pretty obvious about us, right? And for you, it's very obvious what you're about and what you do, that it's connected to health and wellness and nourishment. And it's obvious from talking to you. It's obvious from looking at your Instagram and your website. And then, of course, working with you. The first house is where we really come to terms with, who am I in the world? And, here you are, and you have a number of planets in the first house, but here you are. One of your things is that you are somebody that's learning how to mother. And that means mothering your clients and mothering your chickens and mothering your body and mothering your mother and, your partner and everything.
Right.
So how does that feel?
Oh, interesting, right? It's like yesterday, actually, I was talking to Olivia, one of the people in our community, and we were talking about leadership. And I was like, hold on, can we just like clear any definition of what a leader is? Like, why do we think we know what leadership is? Because I don't think we've seen leadership that's really fantastic, right? And it's almost like that same question posed back to myself. We've seen mothering that is fantastic, but in the sense of like mothering the self, or mothering when it's not in the literal mother-child situation, it's like, what is mothering? That's where my brain just went. Like, what is it even? Maybe the transmission of wisdom through experience, and that might be so that, future experiences can be better. And that might be like what that feels like for me, is if it's in the first house and it's, the house of self, and it extends to all these experiences of how I interact with people. The only way that it makes sense to me is like, what have you experienced that was optimal or less than, and what did you learn from it, and how can it be integrated for a better outcome in the future?
Wow. That is great. That's great. And, it's funny. I don't know where I read this, but I have it written down, and it's on my desk, and I just happened to lay my eyes on it. But it says the trap of mothering equals losing touch with our own needs. And so it reminds me of many things, your own mother wishing that she had not lost touch with her own needs in quite the same way. Right. And with you really using your own needs as the touchstone for helping other people and teaching them that their own needs, that is really the key, right? So it can be the trap, losing touch, and the key is not losing touch, and right, really maintaining that in whatever we're trying to do in our lives, whether it's animals, pets, partners, careers, whatever it is. We have to stay in touch with our own needs. Otherwise, we start to systematically lose so many different juicy aspects of all of it.
Oh gosh, yes, that's the foundation. Wow. I'm just like, I am elated right now with just how that synchronicity just tied in, because as you read that and just really distilled that point down, my brain went, what would this world be like if everyone was in touch with their own needs?
Oh.
Right? Like, what would it be like? I mean, imagine interfacing with people all day who were deeply nourished, aware of their needs, even if they all weren't being met, just to be aware of them and being like, hey, look, like I might be a little off today. I didn't sleep super well. Or, hey, my partner's been gone, so I haven't had any intimate connection for the last 3 weeks. So like, if I'm a little on edge, that's why, like they don't even have to be met, but just being aware of them and integrating the magnitude of what happens when we actually do meet them.
Yes. Yes. Oh my God. So much food for thought. Oh, so Alyssa, this feels like a good place to stop. But Agreed. Before we do that, where can people find you if they want to work with you?
People can find, so there's a variety of different places, and I show up a little bit differently in each place. you can find me at nourishmentnutrition.com. So that's, the easiest way to get just like a foothold on all the other places that you can find me. But nourishmentnutrition.com is the website through which you can find me. And then you can find me on Instagram at nourishment_nutrition_. And that's more of my food centric. It's kind of like a come and go. I post some food pictures. There's not a whole lot of food information, just because sharing food information online is not the smartest, because there's no one size fits all, right? That everyone's so different. Then you can also find me at Alyssa_Neill, which is my Instagram. And that's my personal Instagram, but I weave in so many different concepts that deal with nourishment and wellness on multiple different levels into that Instagram. But primarily that is an outlet for self-expression and growth. So, if you want to see kind of the offshoots of what happens when you're nourished, I always say, look at my personal Instagram. If you want to contact me to work together, go to my website or my Nourishment Nutrition Instagram. And then I also have a Patreon, which is in the very beginning stages of growing, and it will host so many different things as the future rolls out, but that is called Vivid Revival. And you can also find that through the Nourishment Nutrition website.
Awesome. And I know that you and Olivia, who you mentioned earlier, hold these amazing moon ceremonies every month, if not more often. So if any of you listening are in local Boulder, Denver area, definitely check those out. And you post about those as they're coming up.
Yes.
And I think that you're talking about doing retreats in the next several months too. Is that accurate?
Yes. So we've actually already held 2 retreats. One was in September and one was in December, and they were both wildly successful. We've kind of, with all of the travel kind of intermission happening right now, we have been a little bit iffy to put it into stone, because we do want to definitely respect what's going on. But yeah, there will be, again, as we roll out here, there will be a point in time when there are maybe like 4 to 6 retreats. We call them intensives just because, honestly, yes, it is a retreat. Yes, you will meet people, but who inspire you and who you can really like coalesce and nourish with. But they are a lot more like intensives, where you come, there's workshop, there's embodiment, there's movement, there's workshop, there's embodiment, there's movement, and you kind of leave and you're like, holy moly, what just happened? I am a different person. It's a lot less like a, quote unquote retreat where you're finding solace. Like, yes, you'll find that feeling, but not through like rest. So we've been calling them intensives because at this point, that's kind of, everyone leaves and they're like, did we just go through like a month together in 4 days? So know me, Olivia, so I'm sure the intensity is, you can imagine.
Yeah. And I mean, just for anyone listening, I went to my first, I think it was a new moon ceremony with you guys a few months ago. And it was really intense / amazing, and I'm very, very picky about who I work with, just because I, just Capricorn. But
so I know you wouldn't say that, but not the knows her stuff. If you don't work with her, good. She knows her stuff.
Yeah. So, the work that you do in both the nourishment, the nutrition, and in the intensives and the ceremonial work is just really incredibly powerful. So
Thank you.
So check Alyssa out. And this was so fun. I took so many great notes. I can't wait to go back through them. And I just appreciate so much you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh my gosh, it was truly my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm sitting here going, yeah, we could probably talk all day and there'd be like 15 podcast episodes born. So thank you for keeping us on track. And thank you to all the listeners too. And this is an absolute pleasure.
Yes, and we'll do it again for sure. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to work with me privately or read more about all of the numerous ways to work with me, visit my website, nathaCampanella.com. I really appreciate any time that you take to leave a review of this podcast on any of the platforms that you listen on. It helps other people to find it. And of course, if you enjoy this podcast, share it widely and freely with those that you know and love. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.